It will be a fun talk. First, I'll start with acknowledgements, because if I put them in the end, I'll probably miss them. This work was done with Carl Bergstrom and his student Martina Donaldson, who did most of the work. Okay. As David just told us, we can look at the value of a Q. And in biology, we distinguish different ways to talk about information or signal and so on. And one of these code words is a Q. And a Q in biology means that there's something in the environment that I can use as information. So whether it's hot or cold can be a Q. Whereas if someone sends me information, then we call it a signal. Okay. So we want to measure the information in the Q, and there's two ways to do it. One is the mutual information, which you all know. And the other is the thing that David was talking about, Gould information, as it's called in biology. And that is simply the increase in your fitness as you get the information. So what's your fitness? What's your best possible fitness without getting the information, without getting the Q? What's your best possible fitness when you get the Q? The difference between them is the value of that information. A very simple concept. There's, however, a problem with this. In biology, we care about what is happening. So if I tell you, oh, look, there's a lion standing there, that would be a signal, but it actually would be quite important to you. Whereas if I tell you, oh, you know, on the dark side of the moon, they found a rock that kind of looks like this approximately, that would also give you information, but as an organism, would be pretty irrelevant to you. So in biology, it matters what you talk about. Whereas in information theory, these two Qs could carry exactly the same information content. And this work centers around trying to understand the difference between the two, and seeing if there is some commonality. So let's do an example. We have a prairie dog, and the prairie dog has a problem. Should it stay around and forage, or should it run away and go into its burrow? And the information that it wants to get is whether there's a coyote around or everything is free. That's the basic problem, and let's assume that the coyote can get an alarm call. Someone can tell it whether the coyote is around or not. What's the value of this information? And we'll do it in two ways. First, let's see what happens when we do it with a game theoretic model. So, as David presented, we have this matrix. It's actually not a game, it's just a choice. And the coyote can either forage, stay around, or hide. If the coyote is around, then when it stays and forages, its fitness is very low, and otherwise its fitness is high. And if it goes and hides, then it doesn't matter what the coyote does. So this is our fitness matrix. And now, how much would it be worth to the prairie dog to know whether a coyote is around or not? Let's try to calculate it the two ways that I presented. So we have a matrix, and now let's see what happens if the coyote forages. Down here is the frequency of what's the chance that the coyote is around. If the coyote is around all the time, then and the prairie dog forages, it will get zero fitness. Fitness here is the way we talk in biology about utility. That's the way we should understand it. And if the coyote is never around and it forages all the time, then it would get 1. On the other side, it would get a constant fitness. If the coyote is around and it always hides, then its fitness would always be 0.2. And now we want to see what's the best it can do. The best it can do is, depending on the frequency of the coyote, up to this frequency it would always forage. Above this frequency it would always hide. And so the red line is the best it can do without information about the coyote. Now let's assume that it has some information about the coyote. It knows exactly if the coyote is around or not. Then it still depends on the frequency of the coyote, what's its average fitness. If the coyote is never around, then it would always forage and the fitness would be 1. If the coyote is never around, it would always always around, it would always hide, and its fitness would be 0.2. And the best it could do is this linear line. Okay, so now we said we can calculate the value of the information. It's exactly the difference between the two. We get this triangle. Okay, this is one way to calculate it. The other way to calculate it is using mutual information. So you know about mutual information probably more than me, but we can the way I like to talk about mutual information is the reduction in number of unknown states. So we look at sequences of coin tosses, let's say, and we want to know how much information we would gain if someone told us about the result of the sequences. So we look at sequences. I didn't get there yet. It's entropy. Yeah. H is entropy. Entropy, but I didn't get there yet. So we have sequences of events, and the theory of typical sequences tells us that when we have a long sequence of events, we can look at typical sequences. Typical sequences, the properties are that the probability space, when we look at the probability of certain sequences, almost all of probability space is taken by typical sequences. And typical sequences have the property that the number of them in a long sequence of events, the number of these sequences is 2 to the n times h, where h is what is then defined as the entropy, and the probability of each of them is approximately, since there's 2 to the n times h, then the probability of each one of them is approximately 2 to the minus n times h. And now h is the entropy. So for example, we can look at coin tosses. We have n events, and each time we have a probability of p of heads and 1 minus p of tails. And a typical sequence will have approximately p times n of heads and 1 minus p times n of tails. And therefore, the chance of each of the typical sequence is p to the n times p, 1 minus p to the n times p. This is the probability of each of these sequences. And therefore, we can see that here h would then be n times p log p plus 1 minus p log 1 minus p. This is the standard definition of entropy. And now when we want to talk about mutual information, we ask by how much is the number of sequences that we look at reduced if we get information. And so in this case, when we look again at the same example, and here we have the frequency that occurred here around, the information that we would get would then be this p log p times a plus 1 minus p log 1 minus p. So we have now these two ways to look at information. One is this Gould information difference in value, and the other is this Shannon information of how many bits we get if we get information. And they look nothing similar to one another. Gould information here, this axis is utility. In Shannon information, this axis is bits. They don't seem to have anything to do with one another. And my basic question was, is there any case where they are somehow the same? Which seems a nonsensical question. To solve this problem, I was told you should go and look in a textbook. Look at Cover and Thomas. And there you can see an example of a horse race. So now I'll tell you a bit about how to bet in a horse race, which I think most of you probably know. You know the example. But let's see how one would bet in a horse race. So we have a horse race, and please don't be angry at me that it looks very silly. So we have a horse race, two horses. One horse is much better than the other. Horse B has a chance of 90% to win. Horse A has a chance of 10% to win. And if we bet on horse B, for every $9 we put in, we get $1 back. If we bet on horse A, for every $9 we put in, we get $9,000 back. Which horse should we bet on? And the average payoff here is for every $90 we bet on, we will lose 10% of the time, but our payoff will still be $9,000. If we bet on horse B, then for every $90 we bet, most of the time we'll win, but we'll still make only $9 on average. So it's pretty obvious which horse we should bet on. We should bet on horse A. Now let's imagine that we are betting on a long sequence of horse races. 5 minutes. And now, instead of trying to maximize our average payoff, we try to maximize the number of times we would win in the race. So we have a long sequence of horse races, and we try to win in the typical sequence. The typical sequence will have 90% horse B winning, 10% horse A winning, and each one horse B wins, we get 1/9 times how much we bet on horse, 1 minus how much we bet on horse B, which is 1 minus how much we bet on horse A. And when we do this, in a typical sequence of horse races, we would get this back. And now we want to maximize how much should we bet on horse A, how much should we bet on horse B. And when we take then the derivative of this, we can maximize the log. And it turns out that we should bet 10% of our money on horse A and 90% of our money on horse B. That's what's called bet hedging. So now we have two very different solutions. One is we invest 100% of our money on horse A, and the other is to invest 10% of our money on horse A. Let's see how much we would gain then. So we bet A of our money on horse AI of our money on horse I, and we get a payoff of DI, and we want to see how much this gives us. When we go through this, then we can see that we get D times this part minus the entropy minus the Kullback-Leiber divergence between the AI and the PI. Okay, we go back to prairie dogs and try to see what this teaches us. So prairie dogs, what I did before is I looked at how much they get in one game, but prairie dogs will then also reinvest their money. So the fitness tells us how much offspring they have. These offspring will then might play the game again. And then their offspring play the game again. So it is like a reinvestment. You play again and again and again. And what prairie dogs actually, or what scientists do, they want to know who will win most of the time. So we're actually in the same scenario as the horse race. So let's see what would happen then. The one problem here is that the fitness maxes that I have here, when the prairie dog, in the matrix of the horse race, what we had is that the payoffs was 0 if I bet on the wrong horse. But in this case, the payoffs are not 0 when I bet on the wrong horse. So we have to solve this, and one way to solve it is by, so if we bet P of our money on foraging and 1 minus P of our money on hiding, or our offspring, then we can get anywhere in this strategy space. So by looking at P1 minus P, if we have here, we can be anywhere on this line. However, in order to solve the horse race, we would need to be able to be anywhere on this line. So what we can do is invent this kind of non-existent strategy that would give us these payoffs. And with this non-existent strategy, we would have a diagonal fitness matrix. And now the same solution that we had before could be used. And what happens then is that when we, in this range, so from this point to this point, 1 minute, from this point to this point, we can actually use bet hedging, but when we go beyond this point in this area, we would need to do a strategy that would actually have P be over 1, so it's impossible. And the final result is that we get a fitness payoff that looks something like this. So in this region, bet hedging gives us something that looks very much like entropy or mutual information. And in this area, it looks very similar to, yeah, I should finish. That's very sad. When we calculate everything that results from this, we get then that the entropy is, the payoff is very similar to what we had before, except that we now use conditional fitnesses, and it's very sad. And the fitness gain that we get is exactly the mutual information. I'm sorry, I have to stop.